Monroe, and this is what I really want to talk about. Everyone has a passion and a story to tell, something that lights them up. On this show, we talk to fascinating people about the things that really matter to them and to all of us. Sometimes it's funny, sometimes it's deep. Every time, we learn something new. It's what I really want to talk about. And if you want to be part of this ongoing conversation, let me know. My email is tsmonroe001@gmail.com. My guest today is Graham Griffith, or GG. Graham is an open source program designer and journalism missionary who works to spark and support collaborative cross-border work between independent media organizations, academics, and NGOs. Graham is a media strategist and audio producer with a track record of creating programming that responds to the changing media landscape. From launching award-winning national radio programs like On Point and The Takeaway, to being part of the team that created Spotify's Sound Up, GG has developed a unique perspective on podcasting and radio specifically, and journalism in general. He's also worked with many independent media organizations on new initiatives and on building stronger journalistic practices. In his work as a convener and producer of live community conversations, he is seeking to lean on the craft of performers, actors, comedians, and other brave stage adventurers to enable and encourage sense-making around our changing world. Graham and I worked together at WBOR Boston in the late 1990s, early 2000s, dating ourselves here. He was the producer and creator of On Point, which launched the night of 9/11 in response to that tragedy. 25 years later, the show that Graham created is still on the air all over the country. Welcome, Graham. It's really great to reconnect with you. What
Tim,
do you really want to talk about today?
I mean, at the moment, I want to talk about you, but let's see. The menu is there are a few things you said there that I always want to talk about things in the service of figuring out how we do sense making in this era of a massive signal to noise ratio problem. Within that, there is a way where I like to talk these days about not journalism. Like, what if
Mm-hmm.
journalism didn't exist? What would people like me be doing? Which could lead towards what should I be doing? What am I doing? If we can talk about how we gather
Yeah.
and how humans in this day and age, how do we come together and how do we help each other make sense
Yeah.
during a period of accelerated change?
Yeah.
And right, so
Right.
all of these things, because you left such an open frame, Tim, and I'm getting this like dopamine surge of seeing
Well,
you for the first time in a long
yeah,
time and hearing you.
we'll try
This
to
is that
channel it.
you're at risk now.
I
It's
know.
on you. Yeah.
We'll try to channel it. We'll try to channel it. I love this idea of sense making, and Graham, I feel like that's kind of been your job, your mission ever since I've known you. Um, Trying to make sense of the news, trying to make sense of what's happening, trying to make sense of what people want and need from media. And I know that's changed so much since you and I have known each other. There's been this revolution in the media, obviously. So we should spend some time on that. But I think to start that conversation, um, why don't you sort of just tell us how you kind of got to where you are now? Um, and I don't mean, from the day you were born until yesterday, but sort of what's been your journey in this sort of world of journalism and thinking about, how we make sense of the world? Like, could you sort of summarize that a little bit?
I can try. I'll give you a short version and you can expand on it. I think there's a couple of pieces that are similar to the day I was born. Though what I would say, Tim, is that I was born, uh, I'm a New Englander
Yeah.
first and foremost, and I think the geography and oddities of all of New England is highly relevant
Yeah.
to the frames
And
through
and
which I
just so
look at the
people
world.
know, where are you physically in the world right now?
Right now, I'm physically in Maine.
Okay.
I live in Portland, Maine. I'm joining you from about an hour and a half down east of Maine,
Yeah. Okay.
and I live in Portland, Maine. I, I was born at the other end of New England in New Haven, Connecticut, and my family history. So I'm mostly Neapolitan American, and my family moved from Campania on my mother's side to New Haven, and over time We've been migrating up to Maine.
Okay.
And I think for me as a New Englander, working class New England kid living in old industrial cities like Worcester and Providence before, and for me, this area felt like a 2-hour trip home to New Haven felt like a long trip,
Yeah.
and books and maps felt like trips that I wanted to take. So after college, and I had the chance to travel to Germany to play football/soccer while in college, I just decided I need to get to these places.
Yeah.
And so there's a way in which when journalism came to me, I used it as a path to get places that were foreign, not just in distance, foreign in understanding, language, behaviors, and all of that. So I think I didn't choose journalism as much as journalism chose me. I thought I'd be doing a life in academia, and my wife got into graduate school before me, and I took 3 jobs to fund that in Washington, D.C. It was our first chance to be in the same city. One was for a website called golf.com. We could have a whole thing about what do you
Yeah.
not want to talk about, and that's golf. One was a game night work for the Washington Wizards, and then the third was a desk job at NPR, which led to me being asked to join the production team on a show, which 6 months later led to me being in charge of a daily news show. And then I
In
was
DC. That was all in
in
DC.
DC.
Yeah.
It was it was 2 hours. One was DC
Yeah.
and the other was national.
Yeah.
And it was amazing work that if you asked me to do it at this age, I would say I can't do it, but I
Yeah.
didn't know at the time.
Right.
And now I'm, 3 decades later,
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm still in this space.
Yeah.
So like I said, journalism sort of chose me, but I really have spent a lot of time thinking about what we've gotten wrong, what the possibilities are.
Yeah. Well, it's making me think of when you and I worked together in Boston, and you and a team of us launched On Point. Was it called On Point when it first started, or were we calling it something else?
I don't know if this is of interest, but it's important for the story because we're
Yeah.
now oddly at 25 years.
Yeah.
It was a few days after the attacks on the Pentagon and World Trade Center that NPR called up our boss at the time, Tim,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
NPR said to key major markets, we are going on repeat in the evening. This is just a few days after the
Yeah.
planes hit. And we don't have the resources to
Cover
stay
this.
on the air
Yeah.
and give you new content. And
Hmm.
I don't remember if it was 6:30 p.m. or it was 7 p.m.
I think it was 7, but anyway.
Honestly,
Yeah.
unacceptable, right?
Right.
Not
Yeah. I remember that.
that
Now I
that
remember that conversation. Yeah.
completely absurd that
Yeah.
somebody would think that and then say it out loud. To the credit of of our boss, she said, "Well, I've got people who can do it."
We can do it.
What had
Right.
what had
Right.
happened was, you and I had launched another show earlier that year out of
Yeah.
Providence, Rhode Island, which was
Yeah. Your
to
memory's better than
reef,
mine. Yeah.
yeah, called One Union
One Union
Station,
Station.
and
Yeah.
this was what pulled me up to New England from DC, the chance to start something from scratch, and in my mind, we were redesigning the afternoon sort of news magazine show,
Yeah.
and it was going fine. It
Right.
wasn't going well. We
Yeah.
found out that the resources that we were told would be there
Yeah.
were not there,
Right.
and so I was in the summer of redesigning that show, and then when the planes hit, because my
Yeah.
staff was closer to New York,
Yeah.
I sent a few people to New York to try to get onto Manhattan before the bridges closed. While
Yeah.
everybody was talking about you need to get
Yeah.
off the island
Yeah.
because they're going to close, we needed to get people there.
Hmm.
So I sent part of my team there, and the rest of us went up to Boston, and I was helping to coordinate coverage of the attacks. Went home for the first time after 3 days,
Yeah.
and then our old, may he rest in peace, BBC colleague Ian Doherty
Yeah.
called me back in Providence, 7 a.m. and said, "We need you back up here. You're going to lead a special coverage unit. You're going on air tomorrow night, 5 hours of programming." So, so I came back up to Boston. We had a team of new people in mind, and some of the people on my team. And that evening, we gathered them all. That was a Sunday. We gathered them all, and I laid out what we would be doing for 5 hours. And the next night, we went on the air. And thankfully, later that week, a couple of other stations chipped in to do some of
Yeah.
the coverage. So we were special coverage,
Yeah.
but right away, it was clear that people
Wanted
needed
this. Yeah.
this,
Yeah.
and we were doing it a different
Yeah.
way. And
Well,
so that's,
speak about a time when we needed to make sense of something, right? I mean, everybody
yeah,
was hungry for that. What's happening? What's going to happen next? What does this mean? And my job at the time there, one of my jobs at the time there was to communicate with the broader public radio world and say, hey, we're doing this. You probably want to put it on your air. Um, and you can get it from the satellite. It's always one of my favorite career highlights. I used to book time on a satellite. People are like, how do you
uh-huh.
do that? Well, it's just a phone call, really. But yeah, yeah. Um, so that's what we were doing, and then that went on for quite a while
Yeah,
until it moved to the day, right?
yeah. Well, we were an evening program for a couple of years.
Was it? Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, but I don't know. We don't need to dive into
yeah.
that. I
No, the
think,
details don't matter. Yeah,
yeah, I think the thing that thinking back about it, um, and it's interesting. So first, Tim, you would be too embarrassed if we were in public and I were sharing this. I think the reality is you ran cover
yeah. No
for me
one's
on a lot
listening,
of
so it's
things.
okay.
Yeah. Well,
Few people.
the robots are listening, which is
Yeah, yeah.
related to this
Right,
topic. And when somebody needs to listen, the
right.
robots will let them know it's there. You ran cover for me, and one of the things about creative teams is you do need somebody to help control and
Yeah.
have the right creative constraints. And I hope one of the things I did in my career was to partner effectively with the people who are doing all the different work rather than just
Yeah,
the people who were on the production team. And
yeah,
I really did at the time, and I think we were open in communication. It
yeah.
was we pulled off something that we shouldn't have been able to pull off.
No, and
And
it was a hard
um,
time, and it was hard to do there. I mean, it was, like you were just saying, trying to sort of bring people together from different parts of the station to make sure that this all worked, and that was hard to do there. It just was. We won't
yeah,
go into it, but for lots of reasons.
yeah,
And
yeah.
yeah. So, but I think the takeaway, not to talk about another show, but I think the takeaway is that you were really the force behind creating this show, which at first so many people relied on, because it was really the public radio coverage of the aftermath of 9/11. Um, and it was done in a sort of a different way than other news shows were doing it. And I think that, you've done lots of things in your career, I know, but I think that's got to be something you must be very proud of.
Yeah, when you say it out loud, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, the way I'm wired, I think, this is, we all have a feature bug problem, right? Which is
Yeah.
the things that are special about us can be special in one way or the, can in the wrong, with the wrong chemical compounds. Yeah, it's like oxygen. It can
Right.
explode. We
Right.
need it, or it can blow up.
Right.
And so I think the reality is I don't do a good job of pausing to be proud of something.
Yeah.
What I do, what is effective for me in my work is to be trying to be effective at looking back and analyzing what what was I trying to do? What did I think I was doing?
Mhm.
What was effective and how I brought together a team. And when you're an executive producer, senior producer, and you're in charge of the show, you really are a conductor, and
Yeah.
you need to. The best moments for me with teams are when, just to carry this analogy out, the is when I know I can't play the trumpet better than the trumpet player, and I can't play the
Yeah.
strings better than the string, but I can play the strings better than the trumpet player can play the strings. I can play
Hmm.
the trumpet better, so I know just enough about it, what everybody
Yeah.
is doing, and not better than it. Like I hire a team that's better than me at things that they need to do. And, that's not necessarily, you don't want to go to your grave, say, this guy was a great manager. What's rewarding is when you're hustling, 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 and live radio is a rush,
Yeah.
and you go on the air and something happens,
Yeah.
like the wife of a pilot
Right.
who was on one of those planes calls
Mhm.
on the year anniversary of On Point
Yeah.
and engages
Yeah.
meaningfully. Like then and we're going to talk about sense making and the things like gathering. As I said, one of the things I really talked about is how the heck do we gather now? Then and that was the radio age. You can't do that now
Yeah.
in radio because nobody uses only
Phone
certain people
like
use their
that.
phone. So you
Yeah.
don't have a real conversation. You think you are.
No.
When those things happen, right? Or when you're having a conversation about the Bush administration and the cousin of the president calls in to tell Kevin Phillips, look, I don't disagree with what you're talking about, yet you're creating this imaginary space. You think we all gather around like Bond villains? Those things
Yeah.
happen, and or the people from Afghanistan happen, or the flip side of that is somebody like Sarah Chase, who was a terrific reporter, is on the air, and you've built enough trust with her that when she hears the news report from NPR, which was wrong,
Yeah.
and she had told them the other thing, she had told them the right story, and she hears it, and she has enough trust with you that she says, "Wait a second, that newscast, that is not what I reported."
Well, yeah.
Right? And so you have these things happen because you're gathering in honesty and curiosity. When you've
Mhm.
created that, that's amazing.
Yeah.
And so I think uh, we did that more often than we didn't. I redesigned the show in 2020 because it's a different era, and I was able to come back in. And one thing I'll say before we move on is that there's a whole piece of this that I've learned over my career that I knew intuitively in 2001, and when I listened back, I realized I was doing it. Now, considering what worked and what didn't, I'm able to apply it to other projects, which is information cannot be received unless you create the space for
Yeah.
it to be received.
Right.
And one of the key things is you've got to lower the cortisol.
Yeah.
And I think what we did that NPR, CNN, other places were not doing is we lowered the cortisol. We took things more seriously than the people who acted like they took it seriously because,
Right.
I worked with the host then and in a different way in 2020, the different host, because we're talking about the COVID
Yeah.
pandemic. Before we go on air to say, you cannot have stress in your voice. You may not hear it.
Right.
You can't be upper register. I don't care if you lisp, slur, whatever. You have to convey that we are sitting in a space of curiosity and safety.
Right.
Otherwise, the human brain is not going to process that they're going to be all in cortisol,
Right.
which means they're going to be in a fight or flight mode. And
Yeah.
that's what journalism did at the time. They weren't committing acts of journalism, they were enhancing stress.
Yeah. And I think one thing, and it's a good transition, I think, because um, I think one thing that's true of you, Graham, is that even though, putting on a daily, hours long radio program requires a lot of logistics and lots of, checklists and getting things done. And yet I feel like you have always maintained an ability to have a larger sense of what's going on. So not just that we got to get the show out, but sort of what you were just talking about. We have to do it in a certain way so that people can react to it. People won't be threatened by it. And people can make sense because they have the time and they have the context. And there's sort of a mission to that, I think, that you've had, that not everybody understood, I don't think. Like, I mean, let's be honest, I don't think everybody got it, right? Some did and some didn't. And some just get the show out, right? I mean, that's the thing. Just get it out there. Do it. But you had a sense of mission about it that I'm assuming is sort of really continued and is a huge part of all the stuff you're doing today.
Yeah, absolutely. It is part of why I needed to leave
Yeah,
the structure of public radio. I
yeah,
was trying to reveal to public radio what it was for what listeners during the peak periods thought public radio was.
right.
And I was trying to elevate that in ways that might not sound creative now. It was a
Yeah,
creative approach. It wasn't creative in, bells and whistles.
yeah,
It was creative with creative constraints, right?
right.
So the the advantage of the age of live broadcast was that the challenge of being prepared so that when that light was on and you were launching the show, man,
Yeah,
you were flying without a net, right?
yeah,
So
yeah,
if you're in my position, you're not going to be able to fix things on the mic,
right, right.
right?
Yeah,
You have to be a little bit strange, like Doctor Strange. The role, and I should just side note here, I'm a middle child in a loving family with significant trauma,
mhm,
family trauma, inherited and direct in my childhood. And I think when you're the middle child in that situation, you unwittingly develop tools to get through the day
yes,
and to get your family through the day.
yeah,
And so, in a way, my specialty is journalism and sense making during moments of crisis.
yeah,
And that's not necessarily a good trait to have. Yet the things that can be problems for me become assets in those
right,
moments.
right.
And I'm able to block out, I was physically threatened within BUR, by people
Yeah,
who didn't understand. It was a
yeah,
weird
yeah.
place,
It
right? And
was.
people don't know this about public radio.
Yeah,
It is can be a very hostile
yeah,
environment to be in, and you don't have a lot of people stepping up to back you up. But because it was clear to me that I was beholden to listeners, right? So,
right.
so it made it easy for me to make a decision in moments of crisis. It was the moments of, you know, uh, abundance that things were harder for me.
Harder.
So,
Yeah, yeah,
but I think, the thing I want to say about sense making here, as we're kind of making this turn in the conversation,
yeah, yeah,
is that I have now, after that, I did need to leave the structures in order to feel like I was doing the work rather than
yeah.
continuing to deal with a lot of internal headwinds that
Mhm,
were based on the world that was, not the world that would be.
right.
And so ever since I went independent, I started to ask people, clients, I had access to all sorts of leaders, and I would always just throw into a conversation from my Jedi training, just the random question that you plant to sort of get people thinking. And I always have a few of them. And one of them was, hey, so how do you define journalism?
Hmm.
And I will tell you that you ask that of a journalist across all platforms, and the most consistent answer is a pause and an awkward look to the side. And then often the first verbal response is, well, journalism, the news.
Yeah, yeah,
And so I found, I'm not trying to punch at individuals across the sector. We're in this moment where, a lot of us should be asking the question, what did we accomplish for the last 20 or 30 years? Not that we didn't do anything, but
yeah, yeah,
what it is. And there's lots of stuff that we did not get right. And one fundamental piece of that I can tell you is lots of people were calling themselves journalists without practicing or committing acts of journalism. We talked about it as a destination and a title.
mhm,
And then if you ask them to describe what they're doing, they would name the outlet, they would name writing.
yeah.
And so to get to the point, this is why I'm not a host, Tim. Um, to get to the point, for me, there doesn't have to be one answer. I had
Yeah,
an answer, which was
yeah,
trying to help people make sense of
Yes.
the increasingly complicated communities that they're a part
Yeah.
of.
I
Full
think I
stop.
think
Right?
that's it, you know, we were talking about this a little bit before we started recording, but this idea that journalism, people make this complaint, that the news now is not the news. It's not just facts. And it's by and large true. If you watch cable TV or whatever, by and large, what they say is a news program is really an opinion program. Or, this happened. What do I think about it? And what should you think about it in my sort of narrow perspective, right? Um, and that's not you know, in my sense of the world, that's not mission driven. It's not, journalism should have this idea that we're here to make, I mean, I hate saying this, but well, we're here to make sense. We're here to make the world a better place. We're here to be like connect with other people. And we want to sort of have a common understanding of what happens in the world, right? But it feels like journalism now is almost the opposite of that. Not that we don't want to have a common understanding, we want to have conflicting ideas about it, and we want camps, and one camp thinks this, one camp thinks that, and it's really not about helping people make sense of what's going on in the world. So talk more about that. Like, so what are you doing now, Graham? Maybe just pick out, a project that you're working on now that you feel like is sort of helping you or helping others make sense of what's going on.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I would say the stage I'm at right now is sort of developing the ideas that would do that. And we are in a period where we have a massive signal to noise ratio
Yeah,
problem. And the quote unquote news organizations and most of my peers in journalism are finding it hard to get out of the volume trap.
yeah,
They are not measuring impact and engagement, and increasingly not even measuring reach, because once we look at what is happening to search, search
yeah,
is not what search was
right.
a year ago, even though it wasn't perfect. So I would have said a year ago, all your numbers are reach and touches, not engagement and impact. How are you measuring engagement and impact? So I have a lot of different projects in development. One of the advantages of this low funded period
Yeah,
is that I pull on the threads. I have the privilege of conversations across borders. A lot of what I spent the better part of a year in Bulgaria as a Fulbright scholar trying to develop ways for people in the quote unquote West, UK, US, um, even parts of Germany, France, to listen to people from Eastern, Central, and Southeastern Europe, because I had come to find through working independently, I mentioned earlier growing up in New England where 2 hours was a trip, wanting to get to places. So anybody who would invite me to a conference overseas and help with some of the funding,
yeah,
I would try to go. And so
right.
I started to spend more time, at conferences in Prague, a couple trips to Ukraine, um, some time in Finland. So for me, the Helsinki down to Athens is where people, especially to be, centric on our age, to people our age who lived through the transition.
Yeah,
So we are a transition age. We're a small
yeah,
generation,
yeah,
and we use typewriters and then
yeah,
through high school,
hmm
and then we used the computer room in college, and then some people had computers. So we understood the analog world and understood the digital world in a way that those before and after didn't, understand us as
yeah,
maybe a cusp species,
yeah,
and the cusp species in Eastern Europe in particular had who were working in as experts and academics and journalists had this rare combination of the lived experience and the learned experience. And if you're, as a curious person, when you sit with people who have both, that's just such a gift, because they're resetting your assumptions,
Yeah.
because they understand, and they're from countries like, Bulgaria, Romania, like never. Sure, there are moments of empire, but they're a long, long time ago, right?
Right. Right.
Finland's a perfect example, right? And 100 years old as a country, but survived all those years under somebody else's rule.
Right.
The culture survived because of a cultural humility and an ability to figure out how to get stuff done. Now
Yeah.
they're in a period of affluence, but that is a unique, period for them. And the people there sort of get it. They don't blindly believe in any ism,
Yeah.
um, and they understand the pluses and minuses of various isms, and they know how to call BS if anybody would listen to them. So I started to spend a lot more time there, and I spent the time in Bulgaria, and so my projects now are really about how do we center conversation, and more importantly, curious conversation, and how the heck do we gather? Ask what do I want to talk about? Like there's one thing that I'm always talking about at least a little bit each day, and that is very specifically the the thousands, and by some measurement a couple million, Ukrainian children who the Kremlin has captured, whether they're in the territories that are controlled by Russia and have gone through from day one of Russia stepping in a very organized Russification, or let's just call it what it is, cultural erasure process, or they're the tens of thousands of kids who've been taken and taken back into Russia. And I don't want to dive into this in this conversation here because
Yeah.
it takes us in another direction. I share it to be a little less abstract about some of the stuff I'm working on.
Yeah.
The core question within this for me, Tim, is like, well, non-rhetorically,
Yeah.
why don't we care
Yeah.
about this? And
Yeah.
so I've been in conversations with behavioral scientists in the U.S. and with all the people in Ukraine who are working on this problem in particular to
Right.
just understand it. And so that's a big ongoing project. It's part of this broader umbrella that we've been dancing with. I was going to say dancing
Dancing
around, but
with.
we're actually dancing
No,
with
we're
it.
dancing with it.
Yeah,
Yeah, and
yeah,
I think yeah, when you talk about why aren't we doing something about this? Like why, whether it's, the war in Ukraine and the Ukrainian children and that sort of thing. But then there's also closer to home, um, so many things that I think people feel really frustrated about and don't know how to change. And again, we were talking about this before, but the idea that we're kind of what's the word for it? We have like outrage fatigue, right? We're tired of like being surprised and outraged and angry about what's going on in the world, and specifically about what's going on in our own country. And we're having a hard time figuring out what do we do about it? Like what can we do? And you said a couple things that I think really matter. One was centering conversation. That's why I do this podcast. And it's not always deep. It's not always like as deep as we are today. It's sometimes frivolous, but it's always learning about someone else, sort of face to face or at least on Zoom,
mhm,
and it matters. That matters. That matters. And you also said, how do we gather?
yeah,
And I just yesterday. I was listening to a show that you know very well called On Being with Krista Tippett, and she was interviewing Tracy K. Smith and Joy Harjo, who are both former poets laureate. And the show was, I'm a literary type. The show is ostensibly about this poetry and why it matters, why it still matters, why it should matter, and that's what it was about. But it really wasn't. It was about them wanting to have conversations with people about language and about what things mean. And when they were both poets laureate, they went around the country and they had conversations with people. Often people, not just on the coasts in the big cities, but in rural places. And in Tracy K. Smith in particular said she was just warmly welcomed by by people in these places. And this is a woman of color, a poet, walking into, name your red state, and being warmly welcomed and people really wanting to talk to her. And I feel like that's what we need. Now, I don't know how to do it other than in my own little way, but I feel like that's, maybe talking across difference is one way to put it. But just gathering with anybody, like a group of people and
Yeah.
say, hey, let's talk about something. Yeah.
Yeah. I think there's a lot there. So first of all, just a shout out to Krista,
Yeah.
who I did work with, and it has to do with less on developing the content and more how do you create the space for her to do and her team
Yeah.
to do the work that they were doing.
She
And
has she has a
so,
mission for sure.
yeah,
Yeah.
and we gathered, we met because of something that she was trying to do called the Civil Conversations Project,
Hmm.
which, looking back, is not the right approach for now.
Yeah.
In fact, it isn't even the right framing. And I'm going to say these as ands, not buts, Tim.
Where, yeah,
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 they're
yeah,
like
yeah.
I am spending a lot of time being allowing my brain to be pedantic and pick up on words and think, is that what if I change that word?
Right.
Um, and I need to control verbally responding
Yeah.
because I need to know that we're in a space with whomever I'm speaking with, um, where we have the comfort to speak in draft, and that when I call out a word, I'm
Yeah.
not calling out a person. Now
Right.
you can overcompensate, and there are times when is it my job? It might be my job
Yeah.
to name it and take the hit and have somebody hate me,
Right.
but
Right.
move on
Yeah.
and rethink this. So for example, just because I know I could trust you, like I don't use red state or blue state. I don't use liberal or conservative.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm working really hard to identify signifiers
Yeah.
and eliminate them from the practice.
Right.
And so I'm the anti-Doge in the sense that I think sense making requires us to create space where we can be inefficient
Hmm.
and not get stressed out. And
Yeah.
we've all had the experience of inefficiency where one of us is ready to be inefficient, but the other person isn't because they got to go pick up the kid
Sure.
and they're saying, I got 5 more minutes. And
Yeah.
so you cannot, you have to be, it's a lot of work, although all the other stuff that isn't a lot of work is going to create more work down the road. So on Being's a great example, even though I wouldn't use the same approaches that Krista uses in my own practice now. The other quote that I'm reminded of is one of the early Civil Conversations Project shows/conversations with Anthony Appia, who, just because little factoids are interesting, guess who's coming to dinner or look who's coming to dinner. Guess who's coming to dinner? All right,
Yes.
Sydney, guess who's coming to
Yes.
dinner?
Yeah.
Sydney Poitier. That's ostensibly his parents, right? And so
Yeah.
Anthony Appia, who goes on to being a columnist and ethicist, columnist for the New York Times, he uses this phrase that you and I both like the shared language of sport
Yeah.
sometime.
Yeah.
And Appia talks about sidling up to differences
Hmm.
and being in Pittsburgh and having a conversation about the Steelers
Yeah.
and then being humans in that conversation.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then you can get to the hard stuff,
Right.
which doesn't mean that the sport is nonsense. The
Yeah.
one good quote from John Paul II that I like is about the global language of football, where he says or said, of all the unimportant things, football is the most important. I travel the world and my entry points are coffee, football, sometimes beer, cuisine. Football in particular
Football,
is a
but when you say
way.
football, do you mean soccer?
I say global football,
Okay.
global football. Yeah, so sorry,
We are in
association
America.
football, soccer.
Yeah.
Uh, and yeah, so this is an example of being intentionally pedantic, not being
Yes.
snobby,
Right.
choosing the global language. Because if you're a soccer fan, it's only one day you're over someplace else in a conversation about
Yeah.
this, and it's football, dude. But the point being, right, that having literacy on something like that
Right.
And curiosity is what I mean by literacy,
Yeah.
allows you to open it. And Tracy Smith's approach, you know, similar to Krista, right? These are people we know get paid for their words.
Mhm.
And when you get to see them speak, their superpower is this phrase I used to use about Krista and Terry Gross in past years and Tanya Mosley. You can hear them listening.
Yes. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Even though you aren't seeing them, you're
Yeah.
listening to a conversation, and I say that to you, and it's counterintuitive,
No,
and
I
you can
get it.
hear them listening,
Yeah.
and they're active listening, the space
Yeah.
they make, not in a way where they're just letting anybody say what they want.
Right.
They're creating space for real conversation that is non-transactional and
Yeah.
delivers in a way that transactional conversations don't.
I think it's almost no accident that those are all women that you mentioned. I've like I have there's so many things I want to talk about. But we have limited amount of time. But one of the sort of ideas, and you were sort of getting at this, is that um I love the way you talked about trying to eliminate that language, the sort of divisive language from your practice and just your life, right? Um, because it has become a sense of identity for so many people. Whether you are blue, red, liberal, conservative, what part of the country you're from, and it just gets leveraged in the conversations. Like, it's primary season here, and the two guys who are running for the Republican nomination for Senate in Kentucky are sort of outdueling each other over nothing, literally
Yeah,
nothing that affects anybody. It's all about how can we attack the woke liberals. It has nothing to do with anything that's going to help anybody's life. But the Democrats are really no better. I'm not taking sides on sort of political rhetoric here, but I can just remember when we were younger, and again, not to sound like a grumpy old man here, but I grew up in suburban Chicago, and there were, I would say, equal number of Republicans and Democrats who lived in our little block, where all the houses were very close together and everybody knew each other, right? Nobody gave a damn. Um, maybe on election day you might ask who'd you vote for, right? But it wasn't part of your identity as a person that you were a Republican or a Democrat the way it is now. And I wish we could just strip that away from everybody, because what people cared about was how your kids, did you see the high school football game last night or whatever, like stuff that matters in people's daily lives, but not like who did you vote for? And so that means you're not on my team. And how do we fix that? How do we gather, as you said, with people who, don't want to be labeled in this way? I don't know the answer to the question, but it's something that I'm really, really interested in exploring.
yeah. I will say again, this is an and, not a but.
Yeah.
I want to
Yeah.
be sure you don't
You
hear
can
it
butt
that
me
way.
whenever you want, Graham.
Well, I mean, it's actually a good example. Like, how do we do this? Every time you think. So there are a few things in my practice that might be interesting or might be, you might need more things on the virtual cutting room floor.
Yeah.
And one is that when my brain thinks but or writes but, um, unless it's butt, which is
Yeah,
perfectly
which
great.
perfectly fine. Yeah.
Yeah, I change it to and. I do the
Hmm.
exercise of, if I change this to and,
Hmm.
what does that add to what I'm trying to convey? And
Yeah.
I would say roughly 84% of the time, give or take,
Yeah. Yeah.
it is an improvement,
Yeah.
and allows me to convey something. So but is a reflex term,
Hmm.
and you could have I did pitch this to Mukul Devachan, who's one of the people who works in the AI space. He's the AI um, experimenter in chief for the New York Times. And I said, what I want is a tool that goes through the Times every day and changes every but to and I get people to read it, and then I test who knows more. And I don't mean knows more facts, like
Yeah.
who is curious and has a sense of what's happening. So that's one practice. So I'm naming it and practicing it at the same time, just to be as tedious as possible
Yeah.
for you. The another is be thoughtful, not careful.
Mm.
We have to stop being careful.
Yeah.
Uh, I at least have to. And again, I'm saying this as a 72-inch white American male of Catholic and
Right.
Protestant ethnicity.
Right.
And then the other is no rhetorical questions. So
Yeah.
if I slip into a rhetorical question, I will force myself to answer. If somebody asks the rhetorical question, I look for signs that I have permission to say, how might we answer that?
Yeah.
And so there's one really important question, that rhetorical question that people are saying all the time. And you're not quite saying it, though you're paying it
Yeah.
some respect, which is, what are we going to do?
Right.
And the answer to that is something,
Yeah.
right?
Something. Right.
And so the thinking that we have to have the answer in a
Yeah.
time when nothing is clear
Yeah.
is a problem and a burden, and it halts us from
Yeah.
doing things. And so really, when you ask this question, what are we going to do about this? We might each come up with a few different somethings. One something in the, to stick in the space of pedantry, is that when we talk about the whole issue of identity politics, which also is a signifier that depending on the ears means different things.
Right.
The identity politics you're talking about, which is this sort of team concept, is a construct that journalists have a responsibility for creating.
Yeah.
Um, and I don't want to say every time I talk to well, not every time, many times when I speak to journalists about this, they have there's a disease called yeah butism,
Yeah.
and I don't know if you've experienced it.
Yeah.
It is yeah, but the education system is broken.
Right. Right.
These things are all true,
Yeah.
and we can't. I haven't spent 30 years working in higher ed.
Yeah.
I've spent 30 years in journalism, so how am I going to clean up my yard?
Yeah.
And so with this, I do continue to say to writers in particular, because it's worse in print, that you have to name the party after every elected official's name. You think you have to.
Right.
How does this article change? What happens if you say Tim Monroe has proposed this piece of legislation,
Yeah.
as opposed to Tim Monroe, Republican,
Right.
from Berea, Kentucky, or Tim Monroe, Independent? And I would say, what's lost? What is lost by
Yeah.
not putting in there?
Yeah.
Something I can say something's gained because I'm spending a lot of time with behavioral scientists, and if
Right.
anybody has time, but journalists
Yeah.
often journalists don't have enough time. So what do we do? Like little changes at this point until we figure out the big changes. But
Yeah.
these little changes,
Yeah.
and these
And
little
yeah.
changes
Yeah.
are in and of themselves a way for me to hone my craft and tell the stories more effectively than sorting
Yeah.
these out. So
Yeah.
that's one something. I have a whole list of other somethings
Yeah.
for
That's a great
chapter
something.
3 in
That's
this
a great
podcast.
something.
But each person, what is your something for
Yeah.
now
Hmm.
that will lead you towards another something?
Yeah. Yeah. That's a very good thing. Do something, whatever it is. That's helpful in your whatever small space that you're in.
Yeah. And learn
So
from it. Be curious about it. Do
yeah.
something. See what
Yeah.
is working. If it's not working, do something else.
Yeah. One interesting thing, and this happened on my podcast, is I interviewed the mayor of Berea, Kentucky, and he's a very nice guy, and he wanted to talk about a very dry topic. I was hoping he'd wanted to talk about something more fun, but he wanted to talk about an economic development project happening locally, which is important to people here, but it wasn't the most sexiest podcast in the world. But this guy, his name's Bruce Fraley. He is when I got to know him a little bit, and after getting to know him a little bit, I said to him one day, I said, Bruce, I don't know if you're a Republican or a Democrat. And that's maybe the highest compliment I could pay you as a politician. And he lit up. He smiled brightly and he said, "Thank you. That's very intentional." He's a registered independent, but and he doesn't care about that. As only a mayor could, because a mayor's job isn't, ideological. A mayor's job is making sure the potholes are fixed and it depends on the town. Right, right. But
Should
anyway,
be. I
it should
think,
be.
yeah, I
Right. Yeah,
think the
yeah.
reality is most places we've nationalized the school
Yeah,
board. So,
yeah.
yes.
So maybe we can start wrapping this up a little bit. Although
Yeah,
this conversation will never be wrapped up in any sense of the word. But um
I warned
what
you.
yeah, yeah. I knew. I've known you long enough. Um uh One of the things that you talked about doing or being part of is the sort of convener of community conversations. And we're sort of trying to get at this a little bit. What are you doing in that space? What are the sort of, things that you think we all should be doing in that space?
I am doing a few different things. I would say this is going to sound either arrogant or weird or both, but because I was in Bulgaria,
Why stop now?
fair, touche. I think it's arrogant to say touche, and there I've done it. So why not quadruple down? When I was in Bulgaria and in Sofia, which is an amazing city in large part because by all basic measures, it should not be a functional city. It
Hmm.
should be a city that doesn't work because of the levels of what I would say low grade corruption in particular, and then high grade corruption that is getting worse and worse. Yet things work.
Yeah.
It's like everybody in Bulgaria is a quiet MacGyver. They figure out how to fix everything with whatever they've got. And I ran into the people who were part of what I call the We Can Have Nice Things
Hmm.
Brigade. People who would just, you know what, we need this. And they figure out a way to get it. And one was an independent bookstore that's one of my favorite places on the earth now. And I suggested a couple of events on translation because this is a bookstore that has all sorts of languages, a lot of English language books, German. It turns out it was, one of the people who runs it is a translator between Bulgarian, German, and Dutch. And 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 so Bulgaria won its only Booker Prize a few years ago. This book that I recommend to everybody to explain our world called Time Shelter, and by Georgy Gospodinov. And he is an amazing writer, and it's such complicated writing that the translator mattered.
Yeah.
And so the woman who's a translator, Angela Rodell, also shared in the Booker Prize. And so she was coming out with another book, which was this very important book from the 60s in Bulgaria that had never been translated. And so I recommended the bookstore, translation in the age of
Yeah.
still Google Translate, now we're in this rapid AI translation, is a translation of static words
Yeah.
rather than full meaning.
Yeah.
And so I decided I'm going to produce this and you can do this. And then the day before they said, the only person who can host this is you. And
Hmm.
there's a danger of being a host when you've been a producer trying to tell hosts what
Yeah.
they need to do,
Yeah.
that all of a sudden you're there.
Right.
And so there's no way I could do this in the way that other hosts do things. So I started to practice different ways of holding conversations, different ways of opening conversations. And I have this loose measurement where I want things to be 12 to 24% weird. So a little bit, make people a little uncomfortable so they
Yeah.
lean in,
Yeah.
not so uncomfortable that they run away.
Right.
And the thing is to try to figure out how do we make a call to people to come together on one thing because you need that plot.
Right.
And within it, how do you create a little bit of chosen disruptions so that it doesn't quite make sense, so that
Yeah.
people will look up from their phones,
I go, huh?
or so I started using bingo cards at some of these events, especially if there were so they kept, when I'm in Bulgaria, we do a gathering.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's with a few guests. And sometimes there are even people who are journalists who might go into political talk.
Yeah.
So, I started to do bingo cards. So the audience has this delight of, oh my gosh, I got bingo. And in the
So
middle of the
are they like
conversation,
words in the card that like
they're
somebody might have
words or
said, or like
themes.
themes? Okay.
Yeah, they're things
Okay.
that I anticipate will
Are going to
be
happen.
addressed.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so when they get bingo, they win a prize. And the
Yeah.
first time we did it, it was hard to get people to shout bingo
Bingo.
and interrupt. So the point is
It's not a
to
Bulgarian
gather,
tradition, maybe. Bingo. Yeah.
yeah, to gather with respect doesn't mean
Yeah.
quiet politeness.
Yes.
And so I started doing different techniques with
Yeah.
that.
I love that idea.
One of the things that we've done two of in Maine and hope to do again is I got a musician and an artist to host this series called In a Playlist,
Yeah.
where I interview somebody, restaurateur, politician, or something ahead of time and prepare. But I give them prompts for songs, 12 songs, prompts that range from the song you can't help but dance
Right.
to a song that you love and everybody around you hates. The song from your childhood that
Yeah.
reminds you of home,
Yeah.
right? So using these as prompts and bringing in somebody who people know, and you're not asking them the questions that
Right.
they're always asking. And
Yeah.
I would argue that it's still in an experimental phase. Would argue that in these conversations, we got to know these people
Yeah.
in a way that all of the newspaper interviews and everything did not ever
Yeah.
reveal. So it is about this intentional weirdness
Yeah.
towards the goal of delight. And one of the measures for me, Tim, is I worked in live radio, so I respect the clock.
Yes.
One of the goals for me with these is that I give a smooth landing at the end if I'm hosting,
Right. Right.
and I produce a smooth landing at the end, which
Yeah.
means for these in a playlist, that put in a slot for me at the end to
Yeah.
close it, because
Right.
people who haven't done this, it's hard to tell
Yeah.
them
Yeah.
how to respect the clock.
Right.
And then when people linger, right?
Yeah.
So if people linger,
Yeah.
then you've created a space where people forgot what the invitation was.
Yeah.
They're just in space with other humans,
Yeah.
and delight can happen around hard subjects because it's
Yeah.
the delight of understanding.
Yeah.
And so lasting dopamine hits
Right.
is important. So those are a
Yeah.
couple of things.
I love that. I love the idea of gatherings that are unpredictable, maybe a little bit. Kind of nudge you out of the typical. I'm going to see a lecture or a concert or whatever, or a reading, but kind of nudge you out of that your expectations of that thing, and bring people closer together because they're sharing this experience that they're never going to have again. This has been a recurring thing on this podcast. Actually, is the idea of the third space,
Yeah.
and how do you make that even more important, because that's where people who aren't necessarily like you, that's where you're going to meet them, that's where you're going to get to know them, and it's just such an important concept. So yeah, I want to wrap this up, just
Well,
if we could.
I
Yeah.
know we're almost out of time, but
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
thing or we are past out of time.
Yeah. No, it's
The
okay.
thing that we have to solve for, because I just talked about in-person gatherings.
Yeah.
The question now is,
Yeah.
how do we create these spaces
Right.
in a digital
Digital world. Yeah.
age
Yeah.
where parasocial relationships are actually social relationships? And we do have to figure this out. And there's one piece that people can't solve on their own, which is we need open and safe platforms.
Yeah.
We need platforms that aren't extractive. And in the 19th century, the end of the public commons led to creation of public parks.
Right.
Now, these public parks were designed to control the working class.
Yeah.
Let's not go
Right.
overboard. And
Right.
they were used and became. So the question I want to leave you with, Tim,
Yeah.
because it's something I'm pondering. And, with students where you're at, like, how do we create public parks in the digital sphere? What's the
Yeah.
space that humans can go to now, knowing I'm going to be safe in this space? It's a space where I'm going to play, I'm going to meet my friends, I'm going to have conversations, and this is where the real work happens. And so this is a big issue, right? And
Yeah.
so we each have these questions, these difficult decisions to make, which is when we know Meta is doing what they're doing, and we know
Yeah.
TikTok in particular,
Yeah.
as journalists, how do we open up honest public spaces?
Mhm.
And how do we as citizens demand these spaces? How does philanthropy start giving more than 6% of
Right.
their earnings off their endowment
Yeah.
to create spaces rather than fund products, which in 10 years are going to be outdated? So this is like, if I can
Yeah.
leave you with that as a guiding, like, collective question, that's something I'm
Yeah.
really trying to figure out.
Well, I think too, I know having taught in my career now, spending a lot of time on campuses and here on a college campus, there definitely is a sense of the young people, the students. One, um, there's a lot of unhappiness that's created, I think, by the social media problem. But two, there's also, I think, a burgeoning movement, a burgeoning sense of wanting to make it all stop. Um, you know, but they won't do it unless everyone else is doing it, right? There's the FOMO problem, right? If I can't be the only one who's not on this platform, right? Because then I'll be ostracized, I'll be isolated. But there is definitely a sense of when you bring students together and you're in a space that's just about a task or about conversation and they're not on their phones, you can just feel there's just a desire for that, really strong desire for that. We feel it all the time and ask sort of, okay, how do we build on that, Yeah. Yeah. I don't have an
I,
answer, but
Well, I do know that one step, if we, I don't know how to get to this step. I do know that one step is not asking people to get off.
yeah.
It's providing
Yeah.
a place
An alternative.
that
Yeah.
is more nourishing, right? So
Hmm.
it is, you got to stop on the fast food.
Hmm.
If you have one amazing restaurant, meal at a place that is serving you food that you feel great about, you feel good
Hmm.
3 hours later
Right.
and it was delicious,
It was good. Yeah.
uh, you're going to go back to that place. You're going to
Yeah.
pay a little more to go back to that place. So for TikTok, we can't stop, we can't take away
No.
video engagement. We can improve it, but the first step is to do it in a place that's not extractive. And so, where do I send somebody to, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
this is where maybe it is about philanthropists and say, what do you think you're doing, Knight Foundation?
Right.
What do you
Yeah.
think you're
Yeah.
doing? Because none of this that you've spent 20 years funding pivots to the same people,
Yeah.
why haven't you funded the public park in the digital space? And there's
Yeah.
a fundamental piece. Like, so how do we persuade people on that? And then how do we get every young developer to develop their own and figure something out? But I, I I'm optimistic on this part. I'm
Hmm.
hopeful,
Hmm.
because there's a path
Yeah.
to it, and we got to do something. The first step is something,
Maybe
and
Mackenzie Scott
what
on
is
it.
Yeah, I mean,
Whoever.
Mackenzie, we
Yeah.
should be
Yeah.
looking at Mackenzie Scott and what
Yeah.
she's been doing,
Yeah.
and we need more people to do that at various levels.
Yeah.
But, maybe Tim, the something is we've got to be better about what we're asking for and
Yeah.
how we ask for it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that's a good way to wrap things up. And Gigi, I have a hard time calling you that, but I'm going to call you that anyway,
Sorry,
Gigi.
sorry.
It's 12 to 24% weird, as I think you you
Yeah.
you you mentioned. Yeah. But anyway, it's great conversation. There's so many avenues that we went down and could even go down, and I hope this is, the first of many that we can have, whether it's recorded or not. And I really appreciate the sort of sustained effort and commitment to just trying to help everybody make sense of this world we live in, and that's something you've been doing for a very long time, and just keep doing it.
Well, thanks, Tim. This is
Yeah,
the work, and I appreciate you, and I appreciate how we've worked together in the past. And this, in and of itself, is a privilege to get this time with
yeah.
you. And so, thanks for making the space.
Oh, thank you, Graham. What I Really Want to Talk About is produced and recorded in the studios of Berea College News and Radio in Berea, Kentucky. You can learn more about this podcast and listen to all of the previous episodes at whatireallywanttotalkabout.com. My contact information is on the website, so please get in touch with me if there's something that you really want to talk about. I'm Tim Monroe. Thanks for listening.